I'd like to welcome you to another edition of Todd Talk, where we take teaching theory and turn it into teaching practice. So, as the author of several project based learning books, as you can see here, I am often asked the question, especially in light of recent changes to the way that learning has been done due to COVID, um, which is how do I do project based learning in a virtual setting, or can it be done in a virtual setting? Which is a really excellent question and has an excellent answer as well, because project-based learning can definitely be done in a virtual setting. In fact, its independent nature actually lends itself to online learning or virtual learning, or students being able to do learning at a self-paced rather than the teacher having to direct everything. So project-based learning, if set up correctly, can definitely be used in a virtual setting. So what I'm going to talk about today is how to modify project-based learning so that it can be done in a virtual setting effectively. So the first thing I want to talk about is there is a difference between doing a project and project-based learning. And here are several of them here, but I want to point out a couple of them. First off, project-based learning is usually covering a unit or covering a content standard in your classroom. It's not just something that you throw on or something that you add. That's a project. Project-based learning is the crux of what they need to master, or what they need to learn, is going to be covered through the process of working on the project-based learning. And then this leads us to then another difference, is that a project is just about the product. In other words, what is produced at the end of this project. Project-based learning, it's the product and the process. So while students are trying to get to their end goal of the product, they're going through many processes. And so what do these processes teach them? What do they learn from doing these? What are the skills that they're going to get from that? This is one reason why project-based learning is really good for a virtual setting. Is in a virtual setting, the teacher doesn't have as much opportunity to direct instruction as they would in a regular classroom. Although I would argue in a regular classroom, direct instruction should not be done as much as it is in a traditional classroom, that there needs to be the opportunity to give students more space to work independently. But because project-based learning is driven by student inquiry and students exploration, it lends itself quite well to, again, virtual setting, because then you give students kind of like a task, and then they can go to set about doing that task however they choose, whatever methods they know or whatever strengths they want to play to. They can definitely decide for themselves how they're going to approach learning what it is that you have tasked them to learn. The one place where it gets a little tricky with virtual learning is projects usually can be completed alone. Project-based learning typically involves collaboration with other students. So this can still be done in a virtual setting. You can set up Google Meets. They can do, I've had students that have done Google Docs, and that they can share those documents back and forth, or Google Slides that they're creating, or whatever. But they're able to communicate without actually having to physically communicate with one another. They can communicate through other methods as well. Doing a project is just in the school world. And this is the beautiful part about a virtual setting, is that students are out in the real world in their virtual setting. In most cases, they're in their homes, sure, but they're out of the classroom environment. Sometimes in the vacuum of a classroom environment, students don't see the context of how things work in the real world. By doing learning in a virtual setting, this allows them to understand better this real world context and application. It also has to be designed in the project itself. It has to have a product, or it has to have a pathway which leads them to a real world application. In my book, Project-Based Learning, I talk about the steps to a project, and they are, as you see here. And so this is typically when a teacher is designing a project, these are the steps that I recommend them going through. So first is defining the problem, which is simply, what are students supposed to be learning? What is the content standard you're covering? What is the unit that you're covering? So on and so forth. Second is developing solution options. So this just means what is the product that students will produce at the end to determine mastery. So this is what is going to be evaluated by you, but you're going to also be doing formative evaluations throughout the process when you have check-ins with them, and we'll talk about what those look like. Then planning the project. This is where a lot of the differences between an in-class and a virtual setting, you can massage these details so that they are more conducive to a virtual setting. And we'll talk about what that looks like. Executing the plan just means making it clear to students. Again, because you're not going to have the opportunity to talk directly with students all the time, executing the plan is going to be really important. So making it clear, having a syllabus, having a resources where students can go, or a video that you have shot that explains the project is going to be really crucial for them to be able to understand what it is that they're supposed to do. Number 5 is going to look considerably different, which is monitoring and controlling progress. And this is just, how are you checking in with students? Or how are you managing their project? How are you making sure that they have the resources that they need? How are you making sure that they have the supports that they need? And then finally is closing the project. And this can be done in a virtual or in class, because this is simply a reflection. So a reflection of maybe of what they learned, or a reflection of what they got from working on this unit. And so that can take lots of different forms and lots of different shapes. And I'll talk about what those kind of can look like. So when it comes to planning your project, I always employ the backwards building process. So for all of the books that I've written where I actually give teachers projects to kind of a framework of a project, I backwards build. So what that means is I start with the end in mind, kind of like the 7 habits. So what I do is if I start from the beginning, what I tend to find is I kind of go all over the place, and it's not really streamlined. If I work from the backwards, it's more streamlined. It is, going from the end to the beginning is going to be more conducive to them following an efficient timeline. Now, there are times in there where they are going to veer off this perfect path that you have created for them. And that's okay. That's part of the learning process. So, they may explore some things or go down rabbit holes that you didn't intend for them to do. But that's the nice part about virtual learning, is that students have the autonomy to make those decisions and should do that exploration into, just to do that learning for learning's sake, when they're curious about something, when they have show an inquisitiveness, they can explore that. So the way the backwards building process works is, first you identify what you want them to accomplish. So that is a tie-in between that's the first step of what I just talked about with project-based learning when you're designing. Second is the second step, which is to determine the product that will show what you learned. And then finally is planning how you would develop this product. So it's the first 3 steps that I just talked about, is this backwards building process. So let me show you what this looks like, however. So when you plan the project, you're going to use this backwards design. So you're going to start from the end and then plot out each step of the project. So what I typically would do is say, this is the end goal. This is what I want them to do to show mastery. Now, what do they have to do immediately before that in order to accomplish that? And then what did they have to do immediately in front of that in order to accomplish that? And so on and so forth, until I get to the beginning of the project. And things that I need to consider is that you have to include skills that need to be taught. So are there things that need direct instruction? And in a virtual setting, you're going to have to do this a little bit differently. So you may be able to take your class aside in an in-class setting and have a direct instruction, for 10 minutes or 15 minutes with them, and then get them on their way. In a virtual setting, this is going to look different. You might have an instructional video that will do kind of the same thing you would have done in the classroom. You might have a link to resources or websites that they go to, and you may have links to YouTube videos that do it better. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. Other people may have taught these skills, and you can direct students to these resources. So in a virtual setting, the major shift is whenever you have to give direct instruction, how do you do that in a virtual setting? And there are many different methods that you can do that, which I already laid out. You also want to consider the time to accomplish the task. So I usually give students a window of time. So I'll give them a deadline, and I'll say, by this deadline, you need to have completed this particular task. And then students will manage their time themselves within that. I tried to give them a framework Um, and the reason for this framework, and I'll show you what this framework looks like, but the reason for this framework is I need them to see when they are behind. What you don't want is that student that you give them three weeks to work on something and they wait until 2 days before it's due to start to work on it. That's going to be a disaster from all around. And so you want to get them into the habit of realizing this is not a task that can be done in 2 or 3 days. This is a task that's going to take a bit longer. And by kind of plotting out what this might look like on a calendar, then it gives them an idea. And you also then need to model for students what you're looking for. So if you are asking them to do something, do you have a model that you can refer them to, an exemplar, a good version, and possibly even a poor version of what that might look like, to give them an idea of what your expectations are and what they should expect of themselves as well. So that comes in the planning of the project. So let me give you an example. So if I were creating a unit on trying to teach students the different cultures of Native Americans and how their environment shaped their culture, then so let's say that I decide that my solution option is I want students to create a museum piece. So I would start at the end. They're going to display their museum piece. Now in a virtual setting, this means putting it online, whether it's having a video or having a demonstration or having a website that they've created, but they're going to display their museum piece. It's the end goal. So what do they have to do before they get to that part? Well, one of the requirements that for their museum piece is I want them to have an artifact that demonstrates what it is they're trying to show. So for example, if they're showing the weapons of the Eastern Woodlands, do they have slides that show the various weapons that they used and with explanations as to how the environment shaped this? So in the Eastern Woodlands, they had a lot of wood. So their weapons obviously would be made out of wood, and they would make that link between that. So that's the display for the artifact. You have to create the artifact itself. So this is just kind of saying in order to get to your museum piece, you have to have a display, and then you have to have your artifact. In order to be able to create your artifact, you have to explain the environmental link to the aspect of culture. This is kind of the essential question of this particular project, is how does environment link to this aspect of culture? And so I've put this as a specific step in here because I don't want students to overlook this. What can happen in project-based learning from time to time is students get so caught up in the project aspect of it that they're not learning what it is that you intended for them to learn. So you want to make sure you have this essential question that keeps their eyes on the prize, that keeps them focused. In order to be able to make this link, they have to know about the culture. So they would have to research that aspect of culture. So if they're doing the housing of the Northwest Coast Native Americans, they would have to get online, or you could provide them with links, but depending on their age, but mostly you would want students to do that on their own, to figure out how they can find that information themselves, to let them explore. Before they can research the aspect of culture, they want to identify an aspect of culture that they're interested in learning more about. So that's going to be them choosing one that they're interested in. And so what this looked like in a classroom of 30 for me is I had 30 different kids doing different aspects of culture at different Native American groups. So I may have a group doing the clothing of the Eastern Woodlands, a different one doing the clothing of the Plains, a different one doing the clothing of the Southwest. And when you put that together, kind of the jigsaw together, what you saw is how clothing varied depending upon the environment that these Native Americans were in. And so it kind of goes back to our essential question. Before they can identify an aspect of culture, they have to have a basic overview of Native American groups. So I break these into regions. You could break them down into tribes, although there are hundreds and hundreds of tribes, and that would be very difficult. But I broke them down because typically, even with different tribes within an environment, they had a lot of similarities because the environment forced them to do that. So for example, in the Northwest Coast, most people were fished because they were on the ocean and they could fish, and there was such an abundance of fish that they could capture. They could capture enough fish in a week to feed their entire tribe for the year. And so most Native American tribes on the Northwest Coast, no matter how different their other beliefs might have been, the way that they collected food was similar because of their environment. In order to get to researching the Native American groups, you need to, as the teacher, you would set aside, here are the different Native American groups that we're going to be learning about. And then you can turn students loose on that. You could say, so research about the Southwest Native Americans. What are their different aspects of culture? You could either have them research it. You could have a video that explains these different things and takes them through it. I did it in the classroom. I did it as a lecture for students. But in this case, I would either do a live lecture, or I could have a video that also went over this, or I could link them to a video that's already been created that allows them to do this. But as I'm planning this project in my virtual setting, I need to consider two really important things, which is how much time will be given for each of these steps. And again, this is all laid out in your calendar, and it's not a hard, steadfast, concrete rule. So what you need to consider is that it's very fluid, and some students may take longer to do something than others, especially if you're working with high ability kids. They may move faster on something, but at the same time, you want to encourage them to slow down and go a little bit deeper, so that they're getting not just a surface level understanding, but they're getting a really good understanding of that. The second thing you kind of have to look for in a virtual setting is, what is the direct instruction that is needed, and how will you deliver that in your virtual setting? And I'll talk about some examples of what that might look like. So here's an example of the calendar I was talking about. So I've given students 4 weeks to work on this. And so what I started with was the museum. Okay? Now, in this case, it's going to be a virtual museum. So I would provide a link where people could go. I would invite parents to make an authentic audience. I would invite other outside individuals, so that it's not just students presenting to students, so that it is in a real world. And then I kind of I worked it backwards. So here's kind of checking their display. Here's working on their display. Here's what this may be an opportunity for direct instruction. So what does a good display look like? I could either direct them to websites for museums so they could check out particular museum displays, or I might have a lesson, a mini lesson on that, which I've recorded and put online for them to look at. And same thing with the artifact. They're going to work on their artifact, and then so on and so forth until we get to the very end. Now, like I said, students might do these may look very different. So in other words, when they're researching the Native American group, one student may only need 2 days to do that research. Another student may need 4 days or 5 days. They'll have to figure out how to manage their time. And this is the beauty of doing projects, project-based learning in a virtual setting and in a real setting, is that students have to learn to manage their time. Because you're not walking them lockstep through every single phase of this project, students are going to have to determine for themselves how to manage their time. So if one student is at home and he is goofing off and he doesn't start to research his aspect of culture until the middle of the week, then he's left himself very little time to work on that. And so he's going to have to work harder in order to get what he needs to get. And so these calendars, like I said, are not concrete. They're not written in stone. I always tell students that they're written in pencil, and they can adjust however they see fit. But it does give them a guide. So if you get down to this part right here, and you still have not researched a Native American group, you are really behind. And so it just gives them a guideline. If you're a couple days off, that's okay, because you can either catch up or make sure you get to where you need to get. But if you are weeks away from doing something that the timeline, that the calendar shows, then that is a red flag that maybe you are procrastinating, or maybe you're not using your time really well. Because the way this project is set up is, if a student decided to work only the last week on this, and with monitoring and classroom and virtual classroom management, this wouldn't happen. But let's say that they did try to fit it all in the last week. This is way too much work to do in a single week. They can't possibly cram it in. So this also gives them, this calendar gives them the big picture, gives them the context of, this is how much work is involved. And you can't wait to the last second to do this. You need to manage your time. This is an example of how you might manage your time. But you also give students the autonomy to figure out how to manage their time on their own. So there are some pieces of advice I would get. So when it comes to giving students space. So first off, there's two different types of space. There's mental space is the first one. And so some things to consider. Set long-term deadlines rather than daily checks. So, especially in a virtual setting, you don't have the time to check in with each individual student every single day. That would take forever. Instead, what if you say a few days from now, we're going to check in, or a week from now, or a week and a half from now, we are going to have a meeting. We're going to talk about where you are and where your progress is. This gives students a little bit of time to manage for time management purposes, to figure out what they're going to do. And it shows them that you believe that they can manage their own time, that you don't have to babysit them all the time. It just gives them the confidence to learn how to those the executive functions of time management and figuring out what they need to do, and task prioritization. Allow them to struggle a little bit rather than solving their problems all the time. I know when we went to a virtual setting in the spring, teachers were inundated with emails from students. How do I do this? How do I do that? How do I do this? And it was that same student that in a classroom setting would come up and ask you a question all the time, rather than trying it first before asking that question. So the virtual setting is going to give you even a more opportunity to have students to push back on students and say, I'm not going to answer this question right now. I want you to try to figure this out for yourself. And this is going to teach kids perseverance and grit, which are really important skills for students to learn, especially going into the real world. How do they overcome a problem? If they come to a wall, how do they either go around that wall or go over that wall or go under that wall rather than being stuck at the wall itself? And so giving them the space to do this is going to then teach them those skills. Another thing to consider is when you give them this space, this mental space, you're not micromanaging them all the time. It shows them that you trust them to be able to do a good job, and which will then provide them with confidence. So, hey, my teacher trusts me to do this. They're giving me the framework, but I'm the one making the decisions, and they're trusting me to make those decisions. And so I'm going to reward that trust by doing a high quality job. Now, it doesn't always work out like that. You will have your kids who maybe aren't doing what they're supposed to be doing, or kids who are not managing their time well. But most kids, if you give them this trust, will take that trust and reward you with, an excellent project or excellent learning experience. The second type of space that you need to consider is the physical space. So in a virtual setting, this is going to look very different. So in a classroom setting, this is making sure that students have space to work where they need to work. In a virtual setting, what this looks like is that they're going to have their own home office or their home classroom where they're doing what they need to do. Do they have the physical space to do what they need to do? One thing you want to be careful about with projects is, especially when kids are working at home, is do they have access to material? So if you tell every kid they have to do a trifold, do kids have access to getting a trifold? Or do you want their parents going out and getting a trifold? Does every single kid absolutely have to have a trifold? Or could you come up with a better way? Especially in a virtual setting, there's a lot of things you could do online, whether it be doing a Wii video or a Flipgrid or something of that nature, creating a virtual trifold where it doesn't require actually the physical materials or them having to buy something. So the virtual setting actually allows you to have materials that are going to be easier access to, rather than them having to pay for things or go out and get things. So you have to kind of make a shift there in the virtual setting. Are they in a place that allows them to create an effective working environment? So if this is a child, and you have to consider each child individually, this is the personalization of learning. If you're working with a student that has 8 siblings, and I've had one of those students before that had 8 siblings, is their household going to be the type of place where they are going to be able to find a quiet space? And you may have to help encourage them to find a quiet space, or tell them to go outside on the patio or whatever, but give them a chance to encourage them to find a space where they can work independently without being bothered by their household. I know when I was working from home the last few months as a teacher and as an administrator, having my wife and my kids who are older understand that I am working. Even though I'm at home, I am working. And from this time to this time, you're going to, you need to give me my space. My daughter who's in college and taking her classes online because they had moved them off campus, even had office hours posted on her door, which I actually thought was really interesting. But at the same time, it said, "Hey, leave me alone during these times so I can get my work done." So students might want to consider, setting office hours and saying, "Look, when my door is shut and from this time to this time, please do not come in because I'm going to be working on my schoolwork and I want to have this interrupted." It's easy in a virtual setting when students are at home to get distracted by others or to get distracted by the video games they want to play or the YouTube videos they want to watch or whatever. And so helping students to understand what an effective working environment looks like is going to be really important here. And then again, we kind of already talked about this, but is the setting one where they can independently work? So where they have the space to be able to get work done without being bothered. And so they'll have to figure out how to do that, but you do need to know your students so that you can coach them and what that looks like. So how do you keep students focused on a long-term project-based learning? And this is kind of tricky in that you're not with them being able to check their work all the time. So you may give students, this project to work on, and you've given them a week before you're going to check in with them. What's going on during that week? How do you keep them focused on what it is they're supposed to be learning? There's a couple ways you can do this. One thing I do is a contract. This also can take the form of a syllabus, but basically this just gets all what they're going to be learning in one place. And I'm going to show you some examples of what a contract might look like. Another things I use, which I've already showed you, are class or calendars. Now, I may have my class calendar, which gives them an idea, but students may actually then, you may encourage them to make their own personal calendars. So for example, if a student has a Friday where they're working from home virtually, but they have something coming up and they're not going to be able to work on that day, do they shift their calendar to Saturday to make up for that work that they missed? And so their personal calendar this is the thing about a virtual setting, is it's not a 9 to 5 classroom environment where students are with you all the time. Students are deciding for themselves when they're going to work on something and how to manage their time. So how does this personal calendar reflect what they're going to be doing? Rubrics let them know what the expectations. So this end product that you want students to be able to show mastery by completing, are you making clear what your expectations are? Or are you, even better, are they setting their own expectations and creating their own rubrics? You can get to the point, I got to this point with many of my classes where students were working on projects that were so vastly different from one another that I couldn't create all those different rubrics. So part of the process were students creating a rubric for themselves at the beginning so that they knew where the bar was set, what they needed to jump over in order to be successful. And then on your school website, and anything that you give to students, whether it be a rubric or a syllabus or whatever, you are posting these learning objectives. So what is the essential question that you want students to be learning? What is it that you want them to accomplish by this end? Because again, if you don't have that, they might get mired down in something else. And so eventually their final product does not reflect what you wanted them to learn. So keeping them focused on these by using learning objectives is that visible learning that Hattie talks about. Just here's what I want you to learn. I'm not making it secretive. I want you to learn, make sure you learn this. So keep that in mind whenever you're doing your work. Here's an example of a project contract where students would just put their name. The power standard might be provided by the teacher. This is a standard I really want you to work. Students, they may come up with other learning objectives or skills that they're going to learn. And then what is their overall goal? They might set an overall goal. And so how I create my own syllabi is I do a project contract myself and fill it out. And then from that, then I make the syllabus. Based upon what I've determined is going to be the skills they're going to learn, the standards that we're going to be learning, and so on and so forth. Here's another example of a project contract that just breaks it down to learning outcomes. So I would say I want you to come up with 3 learning outcomes you're going to get from this project, and students would then determine that. Here's an example of a blank calendar. I may give students a blank calendar. I may give them one that is like the one I showed you before that's filled out, where it gives them more guidelines. But give them the opportunity to plot out what that's going to look like. So if I say you have 3 weeks to do this, then they need to determine on a blank calendar what the 3 weeks is going to look like. And what it should not look like is them like cramming everything in the last couple of days. So how are they going to manage their time? Here's an example of a rubric for the museum. This is an Egyptian museum I did, so that kind of overlaps with the. So here's the artifact, the display, and the contents. These are all the expectations that I've set. And so the important thing when you're creating a rubric, and I have a Todd talk on rubrics if you want to take a look at that. The important thing is that you show them what it looks like, not tell them what it looks like. So in other words, don't say the display is really good. That's telling them. What does a good display look like? You need to be specific. What it looks like is it's free of spelling errors. It is written clearly, so it's easy to read. It has an appropriate title. And so that you're showing them now, not just telling them, you're showing them what an excellent display would look like, and what just a good one would look like, and what one that needed improvement would look like. So that's how you use the tiered levels on a rubric, then show them the various levels. And so what a student can do is, as they're working, they can say, okay, if I want to get this excellent, I have to make sure that my artifact clearly captures the aspect of culture it was meant to. If it covers most of the aspect, but leaves some out, I need to have some room for improvement, and so on and so forth. So this also helps students determine for themselves how to refine their work. A lot of times the way it works is they work on something, they turn it in, the teacher tells them what they need to improve, they give it back, and the student then works on that. But wouldn't it be more powerful if the student figures out for themselves what they can do to improve it, what they can do to make it better? And so having a rubric allows them to do that. There's some other examples of rubrics there. So when it comes to the management of your classroom, and this was controlling and monitoring progress in the steps. Conferencing is an excellent way to do this. And so what this looks like, this can take a couple of different forms in a virtual setting. So you can set office hours. You can say, look, from noon to 1 on Wednesdays and Fridays, I'm going to be in the Google Meet. You can come in at any time. Here's the link. And if you have questions, you can ask me those questions. So that's one way that you can approach it, is just to have open office hours that students can come and ask you questions, or run things by you, or you can have conversations with them. One other way to do it is you can actually schedule appointments with students. So you could say, look, I want to meet with you at 12:15 on Thursday. And so make sure you're at this Google Meet, and we're going to have that conversation. And so, and I use Google Meet as one because we're a Google district. You might have Zoom, you might have Skype, you might have various ways to do this. But I think it is important in a virtual setting for students to see you and for you to see students. And so having an opportunity for them to meet with you virtually, to whereas they're not just, you're not just answering an email, they're not just getting, response that doesn't involve the personal touch of being face to face. I think that's really important. So that's why in my conferencing, I think in both examples, it's important that you do see your students and that they see you as well. When you're conferencing, one thing that I've learned over the years is to keep the advice short and sweet. So what I mean by this is they may have several things that they need to work on when you conference them that you notice but don't give them all of those things, because that's going to be overwhelming. So give them one or two things that they can really work on that might also fix some of the other problems that they're having as well. So when you give them advice, there's also the strategy of kind of putting it back on them, on asking them what would they do to make it better, and try to get them in the habit of determining that for themselves. Because again, that's going to teach them how to make improvements without someone having to tell them to do it themselves. So these meetings can take 3 different forms. There are status conference meetings. These are simply checking in with students. How are things going? What have you done so far? Where are you on the calendar? So I always have students pull their calendars out as I'm conferencing with them virtually, and they tell me where they're at, and I tell them, I look at the class calendar and say, this is where you should be. How do we get you to that point? Or, you're in really good shape, keep up the good work, so on and so forth. But this is just kind of making sure that they are keeping up with the timeline. And so it does involve you sitting down with the student and kind of looking at this calendar and seeing where they are. A process conference is kind of a reflection. And this is going to help them in that refining aspect. So a process conference, you're going to ask questions like, well, what have you done well so far? Or what do you think you've done that's been really good? And then they can reflect upon that. And you're also going to follow that up with what could you do to improve it? Or how could you make it better? And so this reflection is going to cause kids to be more self-aware of their work and what is good and maybe what needs more work. And so that can come in a process conference. The final kind of conference is a design conference. This is basically looking at the rubric and looking at what they're creating and making sure that those two match. So a status conference, you're using your calendar to kind of establish where are you. Your design conference is more looking at the rubric and saying, okay, this is where you want to be. Are you there? And what are ways that we can get you there? What are ways that we can, figure out that you can improve this so that's where you want it to be? So those are 3 different types of meetings that you might do with students in a virtual setting. Projects so you may roll out a project-based learning by giving them the actual project and it walks them step by step through it. So in many of my books, I'll have a general syllabi, I'll have a classroom calendar, and I'll have a rubric for what that looks like. You might want to open it up a little bit more. As students become more and more independent in these virtual settings, you might give them choices. And one way to give them choices is through a menu board. So instead of me saying, this is the product that you're going to produce to show mastery, I would say, pick a couple of these that you might use to show mastery. And so giving students more choice. The nice thing about a virtual setting, and it should happen in your in-classroom setting as well, but you're given more of an opportunity in the virtual setting, is that students are developing independence. They're learning how to learn for themselves. And so part of that process is giving them choice in what that looks like. So choice in the product that they're going to do, choice in how they're going to learn certain tasks, choice in finding resources that's going to help them with what they're trying to learn. So giving students more choice is going to be really important. The better they get at doing these projects, you might want to, for your first project, you might want to have a more tightly reined description and what they're going to be doing. But as you go along throughout the year for your project-based learning, your students will get much, much better at managing their own time. And so you then need to back off a little bit and maybe not prescribe what they're doing so much and let them make those decisions themselves. So what I'm going to go through a project. The project that I'm going to go through and what it might look like can be found on the Gifted Guy site, which is www.thegiftedguy.com. If you were to go to resources, I have several projects in there, but the one I'm going to be talking about today is going to be located at that site as well. What I also have on this website are Todd Talks. It's like you're listening to right now. And so the Todd Talks cover a variety of materials. I'm having a series right now on virtual learning, but I have lots of different things in there, whether it be your classroom setup or how to, to do different grading and things of that nature. So just know that that's there under the Todd Talks, and there are, over 60 of those Todd Talks available for you to view for free. Here is an example of one of the projects from my STEM series. And so what I want to do is walk you through this project and how you can adjust it and adapt it so it can be used online. So this one is called Going on a Trip. And as you can read here, the basic idea that kids are going to plan a trip. And how much fun would this be considering all of these summer vacations that got canceled and all the trips that didn't get taken because of what's been going on recently? And so this might be a way for kids to vicariously live through going on a trip. And so this involves, like most STEM things, it involves a lot of science and technology and math. And that's what they'll do when they're working on this. The essential question basically is, if they go anywhere in the United States, where would they go and how would they plan for their trip? I do have some constraints, like most projects. So some things they cannot do, or they have to do. One is that it has to be in the United States. They have to travel by car. So if they're going someplace really far, they have to understand that makes the trip even longer, because they're not going to be able to hop on a 6-hour flight to go to California from Ohio. They're going to be on possibly a week-long car ride. They do have to create a budget, so that's where the math comes in. They're going to use some social studies too, because they're going to create a map and plot out their trip. They can only take 7 days for the trip. So, and you can adjust that accordingly. Like you could give them a whole month, you could give them 3 days. So if they're trying to go someplace local, but that can be adjusted. But basically, the product that they need to provide at the end is they are going to kind of come up with the old version of travel tickets, which the AAA used to give out all the time, which is when you wanted to go on a trip, you told them where you wanted to go, and they would get a map and they would plot it out for you and tell you all the points of interest and things like that. But with the internet, that's those things aren't done as much. But you're going to be having students come up with something like that. So they're going to plot out what roads they're going to take, where they're going to stop along the way. They're going to plan out their meals and their sightseeing visits. So kids, again, will get to kind of be in a real world situation, planning out a trip. And this was in my STEM book for fourth and fifth graders, but it can be used for kids who are older. It can be used for kids that are younger. So here's the calendar and the suggested timeline. And most of these, so what you have to do when you are converting to a virtual setting is you just have to determine what things are either direct instruction or things that you are more in control of, and then how you deliver those in a virtual setting. So, of course, using our backwards building, I stopped with people looking at each other's trips. And so originally this was going to be done in a gallery walk. But of course, this would not be able to happen because students are not going to be present in a virtual setting. So you could create a website of the trips being planned, or they can make travel logs, videos. You could take a lot of different approaches with that, but adjusting the product to make it for virtual is going to be pretty easy. So this is kids checking over their map and rubric. Here's creating their maps. They definitely can do that from home. You don't need to give them a lot of instruction on that. Right here, begin to create map of the trip. And so in this case, again, they're going to be able to do this at home. And here's where things, again, project-based learning a lot of times is about collaboration. You can still choose to have your projects be collaborative in a virtual setting. You can also make them, individually really easily just by changing a couple words here. So have a student double check the budget for the trip. And so just taking all those teams, because originally this was designed as a group project, but in this case, the individual student can do it. And this is not a difficult project to change from being a group project to individual project. And the students are going to decide. So as you go through here, a lot of these decisions are ones that they can make on their own. So deciding what attractions they're going to see on the trip. So students have their own personal preferences. They're going to look at where they're planning on traveling through and what cities they're going to be passing through. Deciding where they're going to eat, the cost of where they're going to stay. So all this stuff is stuff that they can do independently and individually. You might have to help point them in the right direction depending upon their age, but you might provide resources where they could go. So you might have websites that you can travel websites that you can point them in the direction of. Those would be very easy to place on your Google Classroom or on a website to do that. So and then here's the research, the distance that they must travel. So students, again, are doing that on their own. You might want to have an exemplary version of that. You could either have it in a document. So for instance, and I have this document here, which is if they're planning a trip to Disney World, what would that be looking? We're answering these questions and where they're traveling from. And then I broke down so I kind of modeled for them what that was going to look like. And here's all these. So if they're going to stop in Nashville on the way, here are all the attractions that are there. And so I just kind of tried to show them what it might look like when they do this. And students may not need that. You might want to, one thing that I often try not to do is to limit students to my own creativity, my own thinking, because many times they can go beyond that. And so, but I do like to give them a model to give them something to go on. You will have those students that need to see it to understand it. And so having something like that, you could just post that online as a document in your Google Classroom. And that goes back to the very first, how do you plan for a trip? And so this could definitely be modeled. It could also be done as a video. So I could make a wee video and place that on just like this one. And I could place it on, use wee video to make my Todd Talks, and I could place it online and students could watch it. And I give some direct instruction going over what the project entails, what the expectations are, I would go over the calendar with them. I would show them the rubric. So you see the rubric right here. I'm also going to include graphic organizers to help them organize, but again, those can be placed on an online and virtual setting. And then, so here's another example of a graphic organizer that they might think about when they're brainstorming. And then when it comes to the actual rubric, I would show them the rubric and what the expectations are. So I'm looking at their itinerary. So how do they break it down? I'm looking at their budget. How is their math? How is the math, is the math accurate with what their budget was and what they've spent? Here's the map, and this is looking at the geography. And the expectations are the map will look professional. It's properly labeled, large enough for people to see. And so I've set kind of the expectations for them, but they can go in a lot of different directions with that. So you might have a student who's really skilled at computer programs and can find a thing that will map it out for them, or they can use the computer to make their maps. You might have other ones who are more like hands-on and they want to actually create a physical map, and then they would just film that or take a picture of that and show that. And so lots of options within the project itself. So that project will be posted on the Gifted Guy website under resources, so you can take a look at that if you want to. But that's just a simplified version of how you can take a project and take it from an in-class setting to a virtual setting. And again, with project-based learning, that is easier than you think it would be, because there's a lot of independent learning and a lot of student choice in project-based learning. And the same goes for a virtual setting where you can't be there all the time. You just need to determine where are the points where you would have to give some direct instruction, and what form will that direct instruction take. You also need to make sure you set up meetings so that you are meeting with students regularly every few days or so, just to make sure that they're where they need to be. And like I said, it doesn't need to be every day. But if you have an open office, or you schedule meetings with students, you're meeting with them every week or so, just to see where their progress is, see where the quality of their work is, and to help them make sure that they're meeting the expectations of the rubric.